Good morning, everyone. Welcome to History's Lunch on this glorious August day. We're in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. A few announcements. Mississippi has deep roots in country music, and the state is featured prominently in the new Ken Burns documentary on that subject that will air later this month. On Wednesday, September 11th, at 6:30 p.m., we'll host a free preview of the 8-part series here in the auditorium that will feature a 35-minute segment on Jimmy Rogers and a special appearance by Grammy-winning Louisville, Mississippi singer-songwriter Carl Jackson. To reserve your seat, register for free at mpbonline.org. That should be a lot of fun. And then on Saturday, September 14th, we'll offer a beginning genealogy workshop led by Curator of Research and Genealogy Joyce Dixon Lawson. The program will again begin here in the auditorium, then move next door to the State Archives in the William F. Winter Archives and History Building. Cost of the workshop is $10, and you can check the MDAH website for more details and registration information, but you can always just show up the day of as well. We've got room for everybody. Finally, I hope that you will join us next week for History's Lunch when Christopher Hunter will present African American Church Houses of Mississippi, 1800 to the 1920s. Today, we are delighted to have Max Garriott discussing Fort Rosalie and the Natchez Indians in French literary imagination. Chicago native Max Garriott came to Mississippi in 1969 to teach French at the Piney Woods School. He quickly involved himself in the musical and francophone culture of Central Mississippi, co-founding in 1982 the Mississippi Academy of Ancient Music. Around that same time, Garriott began his investigations into the literary and artistic background of the Fort St. Pierre and Fort Rosalie sites. He has recently retired from teaching and lives in Jackson, where he is at work on a project devoted to celebrating in operatic form key moments of the French colonial period in Mississippi history. Help me welcome Max Garriott.
Okay, I turned it on. Thank you so much. I want to thank Chris for the opportunity to give this presentation. Normally, the History is Lunch presentations involve an author who's published a book on the topic that he's presenting. That's not my case. I have a published book, but not on this topic. I do have copies of a bibliography, though, that I can supply if anyone is interested in getting ideas as to, or more information as to what my sources were for this presentation. I first presented this talk in March in both Natchez and Vicksburg as part of the ongoing tercentennial celebration honoring the French Fort St. Pierre near Vicksburg, established in 1719. It is a reworking with added focus on Fort Rosalie at Natchez of the original title, which is Perpetuating Memory, the Creative Arts and Fort St. Pierre des Yazoo. In the spring of 1991, I took my French class at Piney Woods School on a weekend excursion to Vicksburg, Natchez, and New Orleans to tour French colonial sites. While touring the Grand Village of the Natchez and its museum, we consulted the visitor's guest book and noticed that from year to year, the number of guests documented as coming from French-speaking countries in Europe far outnumbered by multiples of 5 to 10 those coming from other European countries. I checked back recently with the museum there and learned that, by and large, this ratio of visitation still holds true. My students and I understood why tourists with a French language educational background would be so interested in coming to Natchez and Vicksburg. It wasn't necessarily to see the antebellum homes. No, as middle schoolers back in France, Switzerland, and Belgium, these tourists had been required to read, as part of their mandated curriculum, the trilogy of works by the first great author of the 19th century in anthologies of French literature, Francois-Rene de Chateaubriand, and his 3 works, Atala, René, and Les Natchez. As a sensitive young man in his 20s, pictured here at age 21, Chateaubriand, who was born in 1768, became fascinated with the tales told by French historians, naturalists, and colonial officials earlier in the 18th century. Primarily men like Charlevoix, Dumont, Perrier, Duprat, and Bossu, and conceived of weaving these accounts of life among the indigenous populations of the New World into a grand epic of man in his natural state, à la Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but connected to an event of great consequence. For a Frenchman, he explained, apart from the discovery of America itself, there was nothing more interesting and consequential than the massacre of the colony of the Natchez in 1729. And I quote, "All the Indian tribes conspiring after 2 centuries of oppression to bring freedom to the New World appeared to me to offer the perfect subject matter for such an epic," unquote. It is obvious from this remark that in his reworking of these tales, he would largely subscribe to his sources' use of what we know as the Counting Sticks legend, which posited a multi-tribal, conspiratorial, premeditated but premature attack on Fort Rosalie at 9 o'clock in the morning of November 28, 1729, and the ensuing attack on Fort Saint-Pierre 2 weeks later on December 11th. I'll return to that legend later in my presentation. Back to our young man here. Chateaubriand spent most of the year 1791 traveling through the northeastern regions of the young United States of America, partly to escape the dangers of revolutionary France and partly to soak in the local color he needed for his novella. Though he claimed to have traveled all the way to New Orleans, he probably never set foot outside the triangle described by Baltimore, Boston, and Niagara Falls, areas he is documented as having visited. For his lush descriptions of our lower Mississippi Valley flora and fauna that earned him a reputation as a great romantic painter of nature, he again relied on naturalists Dupratz, Bossu, and several English-language authors who had described the exotic vegetation and wildlife he never saw firsthand. Chateaubriand was a child of his time. As a member of the generation that came of age during the decade of the French Revolution, he and other sensitive young men were influenced by writers like Goethe, the young Werther or Werther, Gray in his elegies like Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, Macpherson, the poems of Ossian, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Discours sur l'inégalité, Les rêveries d'un promeneur solitaire, and others. These contemporaries of Chateaubriand felt they suffered from what they called le mal du siècle, literally the sickness of the century, le mal du siècle. And I love this description of it. It's described as the vagaries of yearnings that troubled their disquieted souls and the non-satisfaction of their uncertain desires. Their favored pose when experiencing this world-weary sickness of the new century was to lean wistfully against a rock along a shore or stream while contemplating a fading sunset. Here we see such an image from a Chateaubriand reprint of 1849. Returning to France after the rest of the 1790s spent as an émigré in England, Chateaubriand published in 1801 the first volume of a planned apologia of the Christian religion, a self-contained episode entitled Atala, ou les amours de deux sauvages dans le désert, wherein readers meet Chactas, young son of a Natchez chief who, after having been taken captive as a youth and sent to France, encounters many of the greats of that nation, including Louis XIV, then returns to his native country and after being threatened and forced to flee attackers, is rescued by a sympathizing Christian princess named Atala, seen here. I do want to point out those words sauvage and désert in French are not as loaded as they are in English and don't have quite the same meaning as they do in modern English. One modern commentator, Irving Potter, in 1980, reminds us that in the eyes of his contemporaries, Chateaubriand is not a novelist but a poet, and that the emotions, and I quote, the emotions he expressed were initially felt and accepted by his generation as genuine. Much of the emotion is inevitably dated. After decades of realism and satire, the mingling of pathos and declamation we find in Atala verges perilously on the comic. And continuing his quote, rather than a novel, Atala may be considered a tone poem in a minor key, and it is only by adapting ourselves to its mood that we can hope to appreciate its beauty. Here, the French painter Claude Girodet, a contemporary of Jacques-Louis David, has captured on canvas some of that beauty of mood Chateaubriand intended to impart to his readers. This tableau, Le Tombeau d'Atala, or the Entombment of Atala, has hung in the Louvre Museum almost since the time Girodet painted it in 1808. And of course, Atala County derives its name from this fictional character, Atala. Volume 2 in Chateaubriand's planned series, again a standalone epic entitled René, appeared in 1802. And it is with René that Chateaubriand's storyline intersects history, and more specifically, the real-life drama that played out at Fort Rosalie, where the author places him, and at Fort Saint-Pierre, where he actually served. And you'll notice there's a mention you can see in the French of the footnotes down there. You can see the name Vicksburg and relating to one of the characters which I'm about to describe for you. The tale of René, taking place in the late 1720s, features three characters: Chactas, now aged and blind. This, in other words, the fellow to the left is the same person we saw in the earlier picture on the left in the painting. René, a young Frenchman there's that pose, right, leaning against a rock. A young Frenchman who has chosen to live among the Natchez and his Chactas adopted son, and the Jesuit priest, Father Souel, S-O-U-E-L, Souel. Most of this history involves René's recounting to the two men his love affair back in France with a young woman, Amélie. Their love story in many ways recapitulates that of Chactas with Atala in the previous generation, and both the elder Chactas and Father Souel, after hearing out René's plaintive recollection of unrequited love, add their moralizing diatribes full of Christian witness and solemnity to René's sad tale. All three in the story perish at the end in 1729 at Natchez. We are fortunate that Chateaubriand chose to use the name of a Jesuit priest he had picked up from Charlevoix's writing for the cleric in his novella. Father Jean-François Souel was indeed the Jesuit missionary serving Fort Saint-Pierre on the Yazoo River from 1727 until his death on December 11th, 1729, as the first victim of the Yazoo tribe to whom he had ministered. The real man was not as old as portrayed here in the engraving. Unaware of the priest's true age, he was just 34 at the time of his death, Chateaubriand described the priest as wizened with age. As for geographic accuracy in this image, well, if you can make out some mountains in the background, those are supposed to be the Appalachians, according to the story. Souel was born in the real priest, Souel was born in 1695. He entered the novitiate in 1715 and belonged to the Compagnie de Jésus, and arrived in New Orleans in 1726 along with Father Dupoisson, who would go on to serve as the missionary at Fort Rosalie. Not long after arriving at his assignment at the Yazoo post and Fort Saint-Pierre, Souel sought to purchase a house or cabin near the fort until such time that he could settle among the tribe 1 league further up the Yazoo River from the fort. Father Souel was reported by Gouverneur Perrier in New Orleans in 1728 as being very attached to his mission, progressing in his learning of the language of the tribe and showing great promise as a missionary. This is a photocopy of a modern French edition of the last page of René. Note the editor's reference to the Yazoo site in the French of the footnote. And I'm referring to over there on the right-hand side. Okay, let's see. Charlevoix clarifies in relating his death, on December 11th, Father Souel was returning towards evening from having paid a visit to the Yazoo chief and while in a ravine was shot at several times and fell dead on the spot. The reason they attacked a beloved priest requires some discretion in the reporting, and so I will read to you Charlevoix's explanation in the original French, which you can see in the footnote on the screen, which is sort of midway on the other side over there. Le Père Souel était fort aimé de ces barbares, mais il souffrait impatiemment qu'il leur reprochât sans cesse le péché infâme qui fit périr Sodome et auquel ils étaient fort sujets, et il y a bien de l'apparence que ce fut la principale cause de sa mort. Detailed Jesuit records go on to report, Father Souel had a faithful black servant, his only companion and protection, who was attacked and killed at Souel's cabin as he tried to defend it from the plundering Yazoo. And then this is continuing the quotation. Fortunately, he had been baptized only a few months before and was living a very Christian life. These Indians, who until that moment had seemed to appreciate the affection the missionary bore them, at first reproached themselves for his death, but then resolved to complete their crime by destroying the French post. They reasoned, since the black robe is dead, it is as if all the French were dead, let us not spare any. Then they went on to the fort with a calumet, a peace pipe, entered without difficulty, dragged out of bed the Chevalier des Roches, and hacked him to death. He had been assigned to command the post in the absence of the Monsieur Coder, who was the actual commander, but unbeknownst to the residents of the Yazoo post, their Commander Coder had already been murdered 2 weeks prior in Natchez at the uprising there. After that, the other French people located at Fort Saint-Pierre, which numbered about 17, were killed, with only a few women and children being spared. Thanks not only to the French colonial archives kept in Paris, but to detailed records kept by the Jesuits, we have a good bit of information about the earlier missionaries who served not only at Natchez, but also at the Yazoo post. And I want to show you this image real quickly here. The Yazoo post in its heyday, the early 1720s, pictured here, was for a brief moment, as we promoters of Fort Saint-Pierre love to point out, including the soldiers, civilians, and concessionaires gathered around the fort, had a larger population than that of that little supply depot so close to the delta of the Mississippi River that had been established in 1718 on a patch of ground barely above sea level and known as La Nouvelle-Orléans. Just to orient you, if you're not actually familiar with Fort Saint-Pierre, this is on modern-day highway. Let's see if I can use this thing. Yeah. Okay. Running right along across the middle of the picture is Highway 3. If you take 20 towards Vicksburg from here and get off at exit 5, 61 north, get off then when you get to Highway 3 at Redwood. Turn right. Don't go across the river on the new bridge leading into the Sharkey and Nisqually counties. Just continue, and about a mile up on Highway 3 to your left, you will find and now there's an official signpost announcing it, but you will find the location of where this fort was. Where the garden pictured in the image is right here. There is now sort of a turnoff that used to lead to the old bridge crossing the Yazoo River, La Rivière des Yazoo. You see it down there. And then there's a sort of a high hill or hillock that has trees on it now, but that was the location of the fort. Some of this area has sloughed off, meanwhile, due to years of erosion along these high bluffs that are portrayed here. But this picture was drawn in 1722 by Dumont de Montigny. Sometimes these picture idealized situations when not everything shown here was actually in place. But enough of it was that excavations in the 70s and 80s have shown that most of the palisades and the shape of the fort is still underground. Now, next image here. As late as 1724, a traveler like Charlevoix would be pushing for Natchez to be made the capital of La Louisiane, as Quebec City was the capital of La Nouvelle France. Now, this is also done by the same artist, you can tell by the style, Dumont de Montigny, showing Le Fleuve Saint-Louis, which of course is the Mississippi River, and that's the Fort Rosalie. The modern house Rosalie would be about like right there. Natchez under the hill is essentially meant to be at that point, and downtown Natchez is just sort of in the center of things here. This doesn't go out as far as the location of the grand village of the Natchez, which would be about 3 miles out, southeast from this direction, off of 61, and you turn on Jefferson Davis Boulevard to get to it. But this gives you an idea of some of the settlements that were surrounding the palisaded fort there. Let's turn for a moment to the rapid growth of Natchez, and especially the Yazoo post that was occurring exactly 300 years ago due to renewed activity by the Company of the West under John Law. Now, this is Philippe II, Duc d'Orléans, Duke of Orleans, who served from 1715 to 1723 as regent to his great-nephew, the late Louis XIV's great-grandson, and the future King Louis XV. New Orleans was founded in 1718 during his regency and is so named in his honor. In 1717, he elevated one of his big gambler and gaming pals, the wily Scotsman John Law, to the post of director of the Banque de France and later contrôleur des finances du royaume, comptroller of the finances of the kingdom. And here is a picture of Law, John Law. The poem under his bust reads in Latin and in French, "Under the august and wise regency of a prince loving honesty and plain dealing, Law, consummate in the art of governing finances, finds the way to enrich both subjects and the king." And another engraving showing Law. Of course, I could pretend that this was any number of 18th century personages, because they all look the same with the landing wigs on. And here we have an example of a Law banknote. Law was the first to introduce paper money in France and drove wild speculation in stocks based on fanciful accounts of fortunes to be made in the American colonies he administered. But hard reality soon overtook this exponential inflation, and the values of the stocks collapsed in the week of July 17th, 1720. We know this, one of the biggest European stock market crashes of the 18th century, as the Mississippi bubble. And if you remember your Mississippi history, you remember that term, I'm sure. Earlier in the year, same year of 1720, the Venetian painter Giovanni Antonio Pellegrini received a commission to paint the ceiling of John Law's Banque Royale, situated near the Palais Royal, the residence of the Regent Philip II d'Orléans. Pellegrini's ceiling decoration was destroyed in 1722, I hope not by a mob, but anyway. But an oil sketch shown here of the ceiling depicts the allegorical figures of the Seine and the Mississippi rivers united by friendship, surrounded by ships filled with goods imported from La Louisiane. And remember that poem full of hope for the magician Law, his skillful management of the country's finances? Well, listen to an epitaph penned about him when he had to flee to Belgium in December of 1720. Si gît cet Écossais célèbre, ce calculateur sans égal, qui, par les règles de l'algèbre, a mis la France à l'hôpital, which means, here lies that famous Scotsman, that calculator without equal, who, by the rules of algebra, put France in the poorhouse. This page from Vicksburg native Gail Bazart's indispensable resource book for teachers and students of French shows the would-be triumphal cart of Law's Company of the West, driven by madness, the allegorical character madness, with naked risk, throwing worthless stocks to the crowd. Mississippi, who is pulling the cart, is a Native American. This satirical verse was chanted in the streets of Paris after the fall of law, which I hope you can see and read in the upper left hand. Lundi, j'achetais des actions. Mardi, je gagnais des millions. Mercredi, j'ornais mon ménage. Jeudi, je pris un équipage. Vendredi, je m'enfuis au bal. Et samedi, à l'hôpital. And that means Monday, I bought some stocks. Tuesday, I earned millions. Wednesday, I redecorated my house. Thursday, I got a fine carriage. Friday, I went off to the grand ball. And Saturday, to the poorhouse. Right? Hôpital doesn't mean hospital in this case, but poorhouse. Warm up your old high school French. Let's just recite this together. If you could just say the days of the week, that's enough. That's fine. We've got everything but Sunday represented up there. And let's just read it together. Lundi, j'achetais des actions. Mardi, je gagnais des millions. Mercredi, j'ornais mon ménage. Jeudi, je pris un équipage. Vendredi, je m'enfuis au bal. Et samedi, à l'hôpital. Good. The triumphal entry of Law's company card is obviously an allegorical mockery of more successful triumphs, showing chariots and carriages of the truly regal, powerful, and respected monarchs and artists of their day, an iconographic tribute common since the time of the triumphs of Maximilian of the 16th century. Here is a triumph parade from the 1760s giving honor to the French composer Jean-Philippe Rameau. This one is offered, of course, in true sincerity by its participants and not as a mockery. But I just want to see the type of image that was being referred to in that previous one. The Mississippi bubble and John Law's finagling were also alluded to in French philosopher Montesquieu's satirical commentary on Parisian politics and public mores, Les Lettres persanes of 1721. And there is even a direct musical reference to the crash. This is Georg Philipp Telemann, history's most prolific composer ever. In 1720, while living in Frankfurt, he was commissioned by the directors of the stock market there to write a suite of movements suggestive of the daily ups and downs and general uncertainty of their financial ventures. On the right are the opening measures of the last movement of the suite, a bouncy little gavotte entitled, and as you can see, I hope, L'Espérance de Mississippi, the hope of Mississippi, that is, the hope of the great reward in the wild investing then in play. Now, this is the first page of my own take on Telemann's Gavotte, an ouverture d'opéra I composed in 1989 as the flip side or reality check on the boundless optimism expressed back in 1720 by the previous piece. My piece is called La Désespérance de Mississippi, or The Despair or Deception of Law's Scheme. In it, I take Telemann's happy melody in B-flat major and rework it in the more morose relative key of G minor, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. The first few measures of that, what we just heard, were well, if the foot wants to play that last note, it doesn't. There we go. Let me play that one more time. Okay, now I take the exact same melody, move it to G, move it to G minor, and decorate it elaborately, and make it sound more somber and serious. And we'll listen to a little bit of it play in full in just a moment. But that top line, just follow along here. Okay, so let's listen to this here. I didn't mean to press that, but that's all right. Okay. Reading almost like a novel, the recently discovered and translated journal of Makan Tuan Keo, C-A-I-L-L-O-T, Keo, corroborates and complements many details reported by Charlevoix, Perrier, and other colonists concerning events in New Orleans, as reports of the massacres at Natchez and the Yazoo post came in, and of the actions taken by the French to counter them during 1730. As a young recruit, he was just 22 years old, Keo sailed from France to New Orleans in 1729 and was on sentry duty, more or less, along the quay there, which is today's like Moonwalk, when the first boatload of survivors of the Natchez massacre made it to New Orleans on December 2nd. He records the terror of the panic-stricken settlers in New Orleans when the news of this attack, and then, by the end of the month, news of the attack at the Yazoo post made the colonists fear that a planned assault by a confederation of tribes on all the French colonies might still be in the making. It, as he reported, too, because he was a young man always looking for fun, it put a real damper on the Mardi Gras season that year. Now, here's a plan de la ville de la Nouvelle-Orléans, or a map of the downtown. This is the French Quarter, essentially, from Caillots' journal, showing the settlement as of February 14th, 1731, just before he left the city and returned to France. I show this to you to show you the first site of the Ursuline convent before it moved several blocks inland in 1753 to its present location. Let's make sure I hit the right button this time. Yeah, okay. Right there, letter G, that's the, can you see, what's that first word? De religieux, I can't even read the handwriting, but okay. Here it is right here. They put it up, it was being built at the time in brick, and then it moved up the street, which is Rue des Religieuses, but we know it as Ursuline Street today, Ursulines, into this area up here. Anyway, why am I focusing on all that? Because I want to show you a little, treat you to a little bit more music from the period here. We have, the Ursulines came to the colony in 1727. We have musical manuscripts that they and early choirs serving what would become St. Louis Cathedral had brought from France, and that provided the music for their daily devotions and services. I'd like to show you text, and I provided the English translation alongside it, to a song, Agréable Solitude. And this is going to be another sing-along, if you don't mind. I'm going to start it in just a moment, and we're going to sing the first melody. You'll hear it, and then let's just repeat it with the small group of female singers singing this. And then some of these lines will be taken by a soloist, and we'll let them do that. We'll come back and sing the Agréable Solitude each time like this, okay? Of course, the text gives you an idea of what it was like to be a nun from France in this very remote part of the world at that time. Okay, listen. Just a second. Repeat. Agréable solitude, vous ferez tous mes plaisirs. Listen. Repeat. Charme de l'étude, vous suspendez mes souvenirs. She'll take the high notes. Agréable solitude, vous ferez tous mes plaisirs. Agréable solitude, vous ferez tous mes plaisirs. Isn't that a pleasant piece? You can see how it really brought peace to their souls, despite the fact that they were in this very strange and remote land. Now, here's another text. I think we'll just look at it. We may not have time to sing this, but I'll let a little bit of the melody play in just a moment. It lasts 4 minutes or so altogether, so we're going to skip over singing it. But en vos mains, Seigneur et mon sort, vous êtes mon auteur et je suis votre ouvrage. Recevez mon âme au passage, de mon lit au tombeau, la vie à la mort. And you see the translation right there. Music de Jean-Baptiste Lully, who of course was the Louis XIV's court composer. And a lot of these compositions were by noted French composers, often selections from their operas, but they were refitted with sacred texts for the spiritual edification of the sisters and novices who sang them. We can assume that some of this same music, I'll let you listen to a little bit of the melody here on instruments. We can assume that some of this same music may have made it upriver to Natchez and the Yazoo post, or at least may have been heard by those settlers and priests who had the opportunity to travel to New Orleans in the late 1720s. Would they have had musical instruments to perform this, you might ask? It's known that there were violins of all the different sizes, from cello and bass on up, and oboes, flutes, probably some type of keyboard instrument, maybe not yet a church organ, but at least a small clavichord or harpsichord of some sort in these various locations. So it's not impossible that they could have, listened to and made these musical performances on their own. All right. This is the title cover, or a painting, 18th century painting, showing obviously a departure in front of a diligence, a stagecoach, a place where you'd catch the stagecoach. And the name of the book, of course, Manon Lescaut by the Abbé Prévost. Abbé Prévost was a great author of the same period who wrote the Manon Lescaut in 1731. Here's some more information about it in English up in the upper left-hand corner from Gail Bazart's textbook. This was the title character Manon is a fille à la cassette. That is one of these young ladies who was given a small travel bag or suitcase, much like you saw a person handling in the previous picture, with all their worldly possessions. Sometimes these young ladies were orphans, abandoned young ladies, or even prostitutes, perhaps girls who had had a rough life, who were being sent away to the colonies to be married to the male settlers. Anyway, her reaction to this new land mirrors the reaction of many colonists who had been lured there by John Law's false advertising, and Prévost's novel had the effect of persuading many people not to go to Louisiana. Giacomo Puccini turned this story into an opera by the same name in 1893. One of New Orleans' most eccentric citizens at the turn of the 18th into the 19th century was Paul-Louis LeBlanc de Villeneuve, the unofficial poet laureate of the town. Remember, New Orleans is mostly French-speaking at this time. The retired military officer is remembered today for his 5-act tragedy in verse, La Fête du Petit Blé ou l'Héroïsme de Pushauma, the Festival of the Young Corn, or the Heroism of Pushauma. Based on a true incident LeBlanc claims to have witnessed around 1750, Pushauma relates the inner torment and final courage of an Indian chief who sacrifices his own life to redeem that of a son accused of murder. The playwright, who was 75 years old when the play was first produced, came to New Orleans from France when he was 16 years old and lived for 7 years among the Chactas in what is today south-central Mississippi. During these impressionable years of his early manhood, LeBlanc came to admire the sauvages, whom other Europeans reviled, and vowed to honor them through the classic art of his own native language and culture, remaining throughout his life their chief advocate and apologiste. His play, first performed at the Théâtre de la Rue Saint-Pierre in the French Quarter in February 1809, was published in New Orleans in 1814. Our Jackson Alliance Française, French Alliance, locally here, has produced it twice in Reader's Theater format in the original French, and that's what you see here from those two different performances here. Here we see LeBlanc de Villeneuve, the same author, in Native American garb, which he favored for portraiture, even though he was, of course, a native-born French person. In many respects, he can be seen as a real-life incarnation of Chateaubriand's fictional René, when, as a young man, he lived among the Chactas, and of Chactas, the character Chactas, when in old age, LeBlanc de Villeneuve advocated for the respect of the lifeways of the Native Americans. In the preface to his play, he deplored, and I quote, the atrocious catastrophe that wiped the Natchez nation from the face of the earth, unquote, reminding his readers that the Natchez were, again, quote, the most civilized and the most hospitable of any tribe that had yet been known among the French. In its form and rhetoric, his play is an anachronism, evocative in its best moments of older tragedies of French dramatists like Corneille and Voltaire. But its message, an early 19th century plea for human rights and personal dignity, is curiously modern, a multicultural call for respect of the mores of the Native Americans, the playwright so eagerly championed throughout his life. Here is our author Chateaubriand in his maturity, around 1826, the year the final volume of his trilogy, begun in 1798, appeared. Les Natchez includes his retelling of the legend of the counting sticks. So let me explain to you what that is, hopefully as briefly as I can. In the fall of 1729, Sieur de Chepart, C-H-E-P-A-R-T, who since spring of that year had been assigned by Gouverneur Perrier in New Orleans to command the French provincial outpost at Fort Rosalie, was proving to be irascible and contemptuous in the eyes of both the French colonists and the Natchez tribe alike. Chepart, a brash, hard-drinking tobacco planter, decided to enrich himself and enlarge his own land holdings by threatening to take over the tribe's sacred burial grounds around the beautiful White Apple village. Legend has it that the great sun asked for a delay of 2 moons, then called a council of chiefs of neighboring tribes to coordinate a strike against the French. The date for the attack was set, and each chief was given a bundle of sticks to count down the days until the joint attack. One stick would occur. 1 stick to be removed from the packet for each day that passed up to the strike date. According to one legend, the great sun in 1729 was the teenage son of a Natchez woman and a French provincial. The mother of the great son had not been admitted to the council when the attack was planned, but she prevailed upon her son to divulge the secret plans to her. She in turn informed Chepart, who rebuffed her and others who tried to warn the colonists. To save the French garrison, she secretly removed 2 sticks from the bundle kept in the Natchez temple at the Grand Village site, which some of you have probably visited and perhaps can picture in your mind, causing the Natchez to begin the attack early without the assistance of the allied tribes. The fort was badly damaged and approximately 250 white settlers were killed. Many captives, mostly female, were taken if they hadn't already been murdered, and those African slaves not murdered in the sudden attack were freed. Just as would likely happen today, as soon as Chateaubriand's 3rd story was published, it was turned into a stage play. France's foremost author of melodramas at that time, René Charles Gilbert de Pixérécourt, I love that last name, Pixérécourt, using the pseudonym of Monsieur Antoine, produced this 3-act grand spectacle, The Natchez, or The Tribe of the Serpent, in 1827. The play had a mediocre run of 49 performances in Paris that year. Its action takes place almost in real time in the morning hours of November 28, 1729. Enhanced with its own musical score and ballet sets, it also includes characters not found in Chateaubriand's narrative. France's most prolific female author of all time, Georges Sand, S-A-N-D, was also inspired by the Story of Laws scheme, its investors, and the resulting settlement of the lower Mississippi region when she wrote in the 1830s her play Les Mississippiens. The Mississippians of the title are not the residents of the state, but the investors in John Law's infamous system of more than 100 years earlier. Her play not only hones in on the doubtful reasoning surrounding profligate investing in wild ventures that end in crashes, like the Mississippi bubble, but also takes on a major moral challenge of her own day and time, that of chattel slavery, which the French would officially banish in their colonies by 1848. This painting by Eugène Delacroix, one of her many house guests, shows her as she appeared around 1840. The play was published in an edition of her works in 1855. This crucifix, now on display in the Museum of Mississippi History in Jackson, right next door, was found in 1974 at a location north of the Fort Saint-Pierre site, close to where it is believed Father Sewell was living when he was murdered by the Yazoo. Although there is no proof that this was his crucifix, the burden of proof may be on those skeptics stating otherwise to prove it was not. In either case, the relic serves as a tangible evidence of and witness to the presence and persistence of those French missionaries, and their names Fathers d'Avion, de Montigny, La Source, Buisson de Saint-Côme, Jean-Claude Juif, d'Arquevaux, and Sewell, who worked in these hills, valleys, and fields of what were for them the remotest outposts of the known world. They can rest well, knowing that the memory of their service is perpetuated in great works of literature that continue to inspire us today. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. And this is that actual crucifix on display next door.
Time for questions. If anyone has a question, you raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you. Today only, all questions will be asked either in song or in French.
Thank you for that enlightening presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
My French is very limited, so I'll ask a question in English. I'm just wondering, I think the French were the first to take black slaves, brought them to Mississippi. I think the French were the first to do that. And
Right.
when that attack on Fort Rosalie took place, Natchez Indians massacred the French. I'm wondering, why did they destroy the French settlement? Why did the Natchez Indians destroy? Because I think they had pretty good relationships up until that time between the French and the Natchez Indians.
Right.
Why did that attack actually take place? And what role did slaves play in that attack, if they did participate in any way, if the slaves did participate in any way in that attack?
Right.
What role was that?
Okay. All through the, well, first of all, the French were probably the first to introduce blacks as slaves to this region. De Soto coming through in the 1540s, there's no mention, at least to my knowledge, of any blacks accompanying him, and that was just a passing through. But so the French, you can see in the entrance to the Civil Rights Museum there on the, on that opening counter, as you look at the early history of things, the 1685 AD called the Code Noir, the Black Code, that was issued by Louis XIV originally regarding the treatment of slaves. They revised it in 1724. So it was official through the French government, but with the suggestions coming from the colonies, including Natchez, they revised the La Code Noir, the Black Code, to obviously deal with the treatment of slaves. They did not allow breakups of slave marriages. They did not allow breakups of children under 14 from their parents. And in the French system of slavery at that time, brutal as it was, they did have a possibility for manumission, for eventually freeing a slave, which is not the case of the Anglo-Saxon or the English-speaking colonies that would come along shortly thereafter, or that were already in place, in the eastern part of the United States, or what would become the United States. Now, as far as the relationship of those slaves, the numbers of whites to blacks in both Natchez and Vicksburg, but especially Natchez and New Orleans, was about 2 to 1, two whites to 1 black. So they, as far as I'm understanding it, the relations were good between the French and the Yazoo, the Natchez tribe, through most of the time that they first came into contact with each other around 1699 or 1700. But then from 1716 on, from the time of the building of the fort up to 1729, let's say 1728, relations were fairly good. But we always have to remember that England was also interested in this territory and trying to take control of it, and the encroachment from the colonies on the coast and all that kind of stuff. That's one reason why Fort St. Pierre in Vicksburg, along the Yazoo, was established, they thought that the Yazoo River, at that time, they mistakenly thought that the Yazoo River might extend all the way into what is now North Carolina. It doesn't obviously go that far, but they were always afraid the English would come sailing down. And English, in some Indian tribes' mind, had better deals, had better trade goods than the French, So there was always this competition between the English and the French to win over the hearts of the tribes among whom they lived. But I think the French had respect for the Natchez tribe, certainly. They had some quarrels with them regarding, for example, the automatic sacrifice of family members as soon as a great son would pass away and things like this. And there was a lot of sacrificial slaughter that disturbed the Catholic priest. But by and large, they respected them as an advanced Indian civilization in this part of the world. As far as blacks assisting them in the attack, I don't think so. I think everyone was pretty much caught by surprise because the Indians managed to keep it a pretty good secret. And it's even said that Shepard was warned ahead of time by maybe the mother of the great son or another few colonists that attack was about to take place, and he just sort of brushed them off and said, "Oh, that's foolish." But he was the first one to be killed, apparently, when the attack began. Now, the big question, of course, is, was it ever an attack that was planned with multiple tribes from all over the whole southeastern region taking part? How many tribes were given these bundles of sticks, according to the legend, and we're all counting down? Why did the Natchez attack 2 or 3 days early? Some say it was because a supply boat came in loaded with all sorts of goods coming up the river from New Orleans, and the Indians wanted to take advantage of that while it was still there, and they didn't want to wait for their final sticks to be drawn. No one knows for sure. There was no one had advance warning that supply boats would be on the way. Back in those days. And then I have a feeling that there's obviously a natural sympathy between the Indians and the blacks who were in submission under the whites. So I'm sure that's why they didn't end up just automatically slaughtering the black people that they found in their midst, although they did probably take some into servitude, or those people didn't necessarily experience a great life after that. Some might have even eventually melded into the tribe itself, but then don't forget the tribe. The Natchez, by and large, living in Natchez, were driven out by the French in very severe attacks just the following year in 1730 and 31. I hope I answered to some extent.
Was there any effort by French Catholics to try and convert Natchez Indians?
Yes, but some priests came with the intention of conversion, and maybe it just wasn't going to work out for them. Some didn't actually, try to go that far. I would say about half and half. Depending on who was assigned to what post at what time. There was a lot of missionary activity, though, especially along the Yazoo River, even before Natchez, or even the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, those settlements down there like Fort Maurepas and whatnot. From 1698 on, there was usually a Catholic missionary of some sort or another stationed among the Yazoo tribe. And to what extent, though, that they succeeded in conversion, I really can't say. But it is known that some made an honest attempt, and others, saw the limits that they could go to change the native people's mores. Any others?
Max, question.
Yes.
After the massacre, was there retribution against the Natchez?
Oh, yes. Uh-huh.
Do they exist today?
They were almost thoroughly wiped out back then. Some managed to escape to the Cherokee Nation, and it said that there were, Natchez descendants living among the Cherokee in Oklahoma into the 1920s. The language hadn't been lost until about that time from what I understand. Yeah, and then some may have fled to, among the Chickasaw in the northern part of Mississippi and so on. Some people wonder whether the Choctaw were in on the deal. The French always wondered whether the Choctaw were ultimately their friends or their enemies. If they had taken part in this would-be conspiration or not. Conspiracy, that's not the word I want, yes.
I know there are a few more questions. We have come to the top of another hour, but Max will be glad to answer those for you. He's got some examples of some of the resources that he's pulled from at the table over here, so even though there's not a book for sale today, you can talk to him about that. Thank you all for coming today. I hope that we see you back here next Wednesday. Help me thank Max Garriott for this program.
Thank you. Thank you.